Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Rader, and in this video we'll look at mini unit A for participation in government on measuring democracy. This video is designed as a tutorial for teachers of participation in government in helping students to identify the characteristics of democratic governments. So I want to start by first contextualizing the unit of study within the Social Studies Scope and Sequence for grades 9 through 12, which is available on the We Teach NYC website. And for 12th grade, we're going to be looking at really the foundations of American democracy in Unit 1 of the curriculum. But for the digital curriculum in the Passport to Social Studies for Digital Learning, it'll appear in Unit 2. And we'll look specifically at mini Unit A. And a good place to get started when thinking about how to design instruction for students is to look at the project-based learning plan and the day-by-day plan for the entire unit of study and really thinking about what the final summative assessment task will be, which in this case is an amicus brief, which you can find additional video resources available as part of the Passport to Social Studies YouTube playlist for grade 12. But in this video, we're looking very specifically at days 1 to 6 in measuring democracy. And as far as the PBL is concerned, the students will develop the knowledge that will support their interpretation of cases when researching for the amicus brief as it relates to the characteristics of democracy. So in this PowerPoint, I combined the 6 days into one slide to really discuss some of the key highlights. So for example, in the opening day, students will analyze the various components or characteristics of democratic governments and really begin to consider how we can measure them using the resource Understanding Democracy, a hip pocket guide. And students will really look specifically at how to define indicators of democratic governments and societies. So the resource for that lesson is linked into the Google Slides and it incorporates a variety of various characteristics of democracy. So for example, under judicial independence, it'll provide students with a succinct overview of what the concept is, so the students can then apply that to their own growing understandings of what the characteristics of democracy looks like, along with how to identify whether or not a particular country is realizing that goal within the democracy. In the second day of the mini unit, students will look at the Economist Intelligence Unit's 2019 Democracy Index ranking, along with access to the full EIU 2019 Democracy Index, and really begin to consider how the characteristics of democratic governments compare around the world and how we can measure them. The third lesson, fourth lesson, and the fifth lesson all examine the document How Inequality Undermines Democracy, and students are introduced to the critical reading for argument tool. And this is also a tool that can be used in a variety of activities. And there are some additional videos that speak specifically to the critical reading for argument tool included in the playlist on YouTube. And it's broken down into a couple of different steps to help students think about a document before they read it. Step 1 looks at the information they would need to know before reading, really considering the sourcing information for writers and linking it back into potential biases that the writers might have in terms of selectivity or omission of particular facts, examples, or evidence as they put forth an article. Step 2 is really to consider while reading, what are some of the ways that students can take notes to help them keep track of what they've read and what they're thinking as they go through it. And then step 3 is a synthesis where they'll put it all together to really think about and evaluate the documents that they're looking at and really considering the kinds of information that the author is emphasizing or privileging based on their own position in society. And really kind of at the end of the day, looking at a holistic evaluation of the argument. And for days 3, 4, and 5, each day is devoted to a particular step. So day 3 is devoted to step 1, day 4 is devoted to step 2, and day 5 is devoted to step 3. And in the Google slide, it's pretty clearly identified as day 1 of 3, day 2 of 3, and then eventually day 3 of 3. The document itself is not super long, but it's also not very short. So students can either read the full source as it is on the website, or students can click on download the PDF and they can look at the document itself. And again, they'll be looking at this document over a period of 3 days. So while the initial page length may seem like it may be arduous, it is something that can definitely be broken down and chunked into manageable ways for your students, and they'll be able to analyze the ways in which inequality can undermine democracy, and really thinking about the various ways that this can manifest itself in civic participation and civics within governmental systems. In the last day of the first mini unit, students will apply what they learned about the characteristics of democracies to really measuring democracy either within New York State or New York City. And they'll be introduced to the New York State City Democracy Investigation Tool. And there will be an additional video forthcoming for students to be able to access to help them really manage that particular tool. So in this lesson, students will be presented with this model. And in this case, the indicator is looking at the independent judiciary. And they'll have an opportunity to consider the kinds of information they would need to figure out, whether or to what extent this indicator is present in the state or the city. In addition, they'll then be able to consider the sourcing information, the author that they're looking at, along with what data the article can tell us about their chosen indicator. And in this lesson, this is the tool that they'll look at. So step one will be to prepare their indicator. So they'll identify a characteristic. Again, just as the model illustrates, they'll consider the kind of information they would need to figure out whether or not or to what extent the indicator is present in the state or city. And then really see it to break it down, not present, somewhat present, and present. Step two involves the collection of data, information. And it may be useful, especially if you're doing this as your opening unit for the year, to introduce the 4 moves plus 1 habit protocol, which is in Unit 1, Day 11 of the digital curriculum. And I included it here for your reference as well. It's very useful when helping students with the preliminary stages of online research, as well as helping students to keep track of the information to make sure that they're engaging in sourcing and really looking for validity and reliability as they engage in academic research. So they can use the hyperlinks to identify various components, and based on the characteristic that students choose or a characteristic that you assign them, depending on your preference, the articles also include the various characteristics that are available in the source. So if a student's characteristic, for example, elections, right? They could use the first 2 links to find information. And then they'll complete the table to keep track of the data that they collect. And then ultimately they'll make an assessment. And they'll really see, is this particular indicator or characteristic present in New York State or New York City? And really, to what degree is that indicator actually present? And that'll be the culminating activity for mini unit A. It really serves as a nice formative assessment to help students be able to illustrate their growing understanding of what the characteristics are of democracy, along to measure the ways in which those characteristics actually manifest themselves within their local city and state communities. Okay. In subsequent videos, we'll dive a little deeper into day 1 of 3, where we look at the critical reading for argument tool. And we'll consider how we can use the article Inequality Undermining Democracy to really measure democracies as they